I stood in the hallway, pie still warm in my hands, as their laughter spilled from the living room like I wasn't even there. She means well, but she's always underfoot, my son muttered. It's time she thought about other arrangements. Other arrangements. In the house I paid off. At the table I built with my own hands. They called me a nuisance in my own living room. That's when I decided, fine. Then they'd never step foot in it again. Before we begin, may I ask, where in this big, beautiful world are you listening from? It's always a quiet honor to know who's sharing this space. Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. The house smelled like baked apples and rosemary, Joan's comfort scents, the ones that told her everything was still in her control. Saturday sunlight poured through the wide kitchen window, glinting off the copper pans she polished that morning, the way her mother used to. She moved slowly but with purpose, her gray hair tied back, her hands steady as she arranged the roast chicken on a platter. Every sprig of thyme angled just so. The laughter from the living room came faintly through the doorway, Brett's deep chuckle, Melanie's lighter one, her son and daughter-in-law. The sound filled her with a strange kind of warmth and ache, the same mixed feeling she always got when family came home. "Luncheon 5, she called, her voice brisk, cheerful. "Smells amazing, Mom," Brett replied, distracted. He was already half turned toward Melanie. Phone in hand, scrolling. Joan smiled faintly to herself, then stepped into the kitchen again to fetch dessert. Her phone was left charging on the side table in the living room. Forgotten amid the chatter, she heard the scrape of a chair and Brett's sigh. Long, weary, the kind that said too much. "She's such a nuisance," he muttered. Joan froze halfway through the kitchen doorway. Melanie's voice, soft but sharp-edged, followed. "That's what happens when old people won't let go of space. She doesn't mean harm, but, well, you know. It's time she thought about other arrangements." The words were clean, polite, and brutal. For a second, Joan thought she misheard. The hum of the refrigerator filled the silence that followed, steady as a heartbeat. Then Brett spoke again, lower this time. "Yeah, I just don't know how to bring it up. She thinks she's helping, but, God, she's always underfoot." Something inside her gave way. Not a snap, not even a break, just a slow, quiet shift. Like a shelf giving in under the weight of years, she looked down at the pie she'd made that morning, golden crust flaking at the edges. Her hands trembled once before she steadied them on the counter. The sound of their voices carried on, talk of property taxes, of assisted living communities that were really quite nice, of how, maybe by Christmas, she'll see it's for the best. By Christmas. Joan blinked hard, forcing the sting in her eyes to dry up before it reached the surface. Her reflection in the oven glass looked calm, older, yes, but still composed. She reached for the dessert plates, placed them neatly on the tray beside the pie, and walked toward the living room. Brett was sitting back on the couch, Melanie scrolling on her phone now, pretending not to have said what she said. The moment she entered, both of them looked up, their smiles immediate, bright, a little too quick. "There's my favorite cook," Brett said. Joan smiled faintly, as if the air between them hadn't changed. "Dessert's ready." She placed a slice of pie in front of each of them, the silverware glinting under the noon light. Her own slice she left untouched. They chatted idly about the new subdivision being built near town, about Melanie's yoga studio, about anything except what had just been said. Joan nodded, smiled when expected, and even laughed once when Brett made a joke about the neighbor's dog. When she rose to clear the plates, she caught a glimpse of her reflection again in the glass cabinet, still calm, still composed, but now her smile had settled into something else, something deliberate. Back in the kitchen, she rinsed the plates, the water running hot enough to steam. Her hands didn't shake anymore. The sunlight had shifted by then, cutting a bright, cold line across the counter. She turned off the tap, stood there a moment in the silence, and listened to the faint echo of their voices in the next room. Their laughter was softer now, but still easy, unbothered. Then she did something she hadn't done in years. She opened the small drawer beneath the sink and took out the old notepad she used for grocery lists. She flipped past pages of scribbled reminders and recipes until she found a blank one. At the top, in neat cursive, she wrote just one word: plan. Her pen hovered for a moment, and then she added another: December. The water dripped once from the faucet behind her, sharp and precise in the quiet. And somewhere between that sound and the next heartbeat, Joan smiled, small, knowing, utterly calm. The next morning, the house was quiet in that particular way it always was after family left, still full of their scent, their laughter, their carelessness. The pie dish sat empty in the sink, a few crumbs clinging to the edge like witnesses. Joan stood by the window with her coffee cooling in her hand, staring at the maple tree outside. Its leaves had already turned the color of rusted copper, and the first chill of October wind brushed the glass. The silence pressed in until she set the cup down, walked to the roll-top desk in the corner, and slid it open. The old file folder waited inside, the one she hadn't touched in years. She lifted it carefully, the manila edges soft from handling long ago. Inside were the things that proved her life had weight: the deed to the house, tax receipts, her marriage certificate. Each page smelled faintly of paper and time. The property title, dated May 14, 1993, was still crisp, paid in full, her name alone in firm type at the top: Joan Marie Halstead. No Brett, no Melanie, no one else. Her thumb traced the embossed seal. She remembered the day she and her husband signed it, how he'd stood in that same kitchen afterward, grinning like he'd bought her a crown. "Don't give your house to anyone who talks over you," he'd said, pouring her a glass of wine. "This place is your say-so, your voice, written in wooden nails." He'd died 7 years later, but that voice never left her. Now, as she stared down at the deed, the echo of his warning rang clearer than ever. Brett's sigh, Melanie's words. Old people, other arrangements. They fit into that warning like puzzle pieces she wished she'd never found. She placed the document back inside the folder, neatly, reverently, and then picked up the phone. "Rhodes and Bell Law," said a chipper receptionist. "Gavin Rhodes, please," Joan replied, tone clipped but polite. "Tell him it's Joan Halstead. He handled my husband's estate years ago." The receptionist hesitated. "Of course, Mrs. Halstead. He's in a meeting, but I can have him call back within the hour." "That'll be fine." She hung up, smoothed the front of her sweater, and glanced toward the hallway mirror. The woman reflected there looked rested, but her eyes had changed. Cooler now, less forgiving. The phone rang 20 minutes later. "Joan," came the voice, older now but still warm. "Haven't heard from you since Henry passed. What can I do for you?" "I need a review of my property title," she said, "and a conversation about protections. I think my son may have intentions." A pause, heavy but understanding. "I see. You're free tomorrow at 11. Perfect." When she hung up, the house felt larger somehow, like it had exhaled with her. By afternoon, she was at Eileen's place, her neighbor of 30 years and sometime partner in gossip, errands, and casseroles. Eileen was sitting on her porch, knitting something bright orange that clashed delightfully with her navy sweater. Joan eased into the chair beside her. "I heard something yesterday," she began quietly, "something that made up my mind." Eileen listened as Joan told her, every detail measured, precise. When she finished, Eileen's needles froze mid-air. "Oh, hell no," she said finally, loud enough to make a squirrel dart off the railing. "He said that? After all you've done for him? After you helped him with that down payment?" Joan nodded once. "I think they've been discussing options for me." Eileen set her knitting aside, eyes sharp. "You're not moving anywhere, Joni. That's your house. You built that life. If anyone's leaving, it's them." Joan's smile was faint but real this time. "I just needed to hear someone else say it." Back home, the light was thinning fast. She sat at the kitchen table, the same one where she'd once graded her students' papers and paid the bills, and pulled the notepad from the drawer again. The page with "Plan December" stared up at her, clean and expectant. She flipped to the next sheet and wrote in bold, careful strokes, "Peace Plan." Underneath, she began to list the items, one by one. Legal meeting with Rhodes. Inventory valuables. Update will. Letters to Brett and Melanie. Final decision, December 12th. The last line she underlined twice. The pen rolled out of her fingers and settled against the paper, leaving a tiny blue smear like a fingerprint. Outside, the wind caught the edge of the maple tree and sent a scatter of leaves tumbling against the window, soft, insistent. Joan sat back, listening to the quiet creak of the house around her. Somewhere in that stillness, she felt something wake up. Not anger, not grief. Something steadier, sharper, like resolve shaped into steel. Her phone buzzed just once on the counter, an incoming text from Brett. "Thanks for lunch, Mom. Love you." She didn't open it. Instead, she turned the notepad over, pressed her palm flat against it, and whispered softly to the empty room, "We'll see about that." The following week, the trees around Joan's property blazed into full color. Burnt orange, scarlet, gold. The kind of beauty that always made her feel both nostalgic and grounded. The house creaked softly in the morning chill, the furnace ticking to life as she stirred her coffee. The peace plan list sat open beside her, each line carefully checked off except the last two. Her phone buzzed against the table. Brett's name lit the screen. Brett. "Hey, Mom. Just checking. Mel and I were thinking we might come up for Thanksgiving again. The house is perfect that week. You'll love the kid's new puppy." Joan's thumb hovered over the screen for a moment before she opened her email instead. She composed a short reply, polite and precise. Subject: Thanksgiving plans. Hi, Brett. The house won't be available this season. I have some things I'll be tending to, and the space will be in use. Love, Mom. She reread it once, smiled faintly, and hit send. The reply came 5 minutes later. Brett. "What do you mean, not available? It's our family home too, Mom. We always come there." Joan took another sip of her coffee. The warmth filled her chest like quiet satisfaction. She typed slowly, deliberately. "Not by law, dear." For a moment she simply sat there, watching the little gray typing bubble appear, disappear, then reappear again. Finally, Brett's next message arrived. Short, clipped. "Okay, didn't realize we had to make appointments to visit you now." She didn't respond. She slid the phone aside and looked out the window at the bare-limbed maple. A gust of wind carried a swirl of leaves across the yard, and for the first time in weeks, she let herself laugh softly under her breath. It wasn't bitterness, it was freedom. Later that morning, she flipped open her laptop. The cursor blinked on the travel site like an invitation. She scrolled past Caribbean resorts and big city hotels until she stopped at a small retreat tucked in the Vermont countryside. Quiet cottages, lake views, and something called restorative solitude. She clicked book stay and selected a 2-week slot starting Thanksgiving Day. "Just you?" the reservation form asked. Joan smiled as she typed, "Yes, just me." By afternoon, she was walking across the street to Eileen's, bundled in her navy coat. Eileen was out front, raking leaves into piles that looked more decorative than practical. "Well," Eileen asked, squinting over her rake, "how'd it go with your lawyer friend?" "He's drawing up the new trust papers," Joan said. "We'll finalize them next week." Eileen leaned the rake against her hip, grinning. "So you're really doing it?" "I am. And Thanksgiving." Joan's smile deepened. "Cancelled their stay. I'll be gone. Booked a retreat in Vermont. Alone." Eileen whooped so loudly a passing jogger turned to look. "You magnificent woman. Finally doing something for you." She dropped the rake and hugged her fiercely. "We'll Zoom on Thanksgiving. Hot toddies and gossip. You, me, and a bad internet connection." Joan laughed. "Deal." That evening, the air outside bit cold. Joan sat by the window, sorting through a neat stack of folders Gavin had emailed. Digital forms for the trust update. Her name appeared in bold at the top again, steady and solitary. She scrolled to the section labeled Beneficiaries, her eyes narrowing slightly. There it was. Brett Halstead, 100%. She highlighted the name, hesitated, then pressed delete. A small pulse of adrenaline fluttered through her. She didn't replace it, not yet. Instead, she clicked Save Draft and closed her laptop. The house hummed softly around her. The refrigerator, the ticking clock, the wind pressing against the windows. She felt its pulse like her own. At 8 o'clock, her phone rang. Gavin's warm, practiced voice filled her ear. "Evening, Joan. Just wanted to confirm, are we keeping your son as the primary beneficiary?" Joan turned toward the dark window, her reflection clear and steady in the glass. "No," she said, "we're not." A pause on the other end. Then, "Understood. Let's make some updates," she added, her voice even. "I'm ready." When she hung up, she noticed the pie tin still on the counter from last week. The same one from the lunch that started it all. She lifted it, ran her fingers over its cool surface, and set it gently into the trash. The metallic clatter echoed through the kitchen like punctuation, and as the sound faded, she whispered to herself, half promise, half prayer. Let's begin. The Vermont retreat unfolded like something from a painting. Frosted fields, a ribbon of mist over the lake, and cabins spaced far enough apart that silence felt earned. Joan's cottage sat near the waterline, its porch wrapped in pine shadows and the scent of wood smoke. The air tasted clean. Every inhale felt like something she hadn't known she'd been missing. Inside, the room was small but perfect. A stone fireplace, a kettle, and a stack of linen-bound journals on the desk. She unpacked slowly, folding her sweaters into drawers, aligning her pens in a neat row. No phone buzzing on the counter, no chatter bleeding from another room. Just the hush of the lake against the shore. That first morning, she joined the group breakfast. A dozen or so guests around a long oak table overlooking the water. No one spoke above a murmur. A sign by the window read, "Quiet hours before noon." Joan found it oddly comforting. Across from her sat a wiry man with a weathered face and bright, amused eyes. He introduced himself later, during the lakeside walk, as Thomas Keene, a retired marine biologist from Maine. "Spent 40 years chasing plankton," he said with a grin, hands tucked into his parka pockets. "Turns out the little things are the ones that run the world." Joan liked that. They walked in easy rhythm, the gravel crunching beneath their boots, the morning cold threading through their breath. Later she met Ruth Carrington, a woman in her late 60s with short silver hair and the kind of laugh that seemed to warm every corner of a room. "Used to be an opera singer," Ruth said, her voice still rich, resonant. "These days, I just hummed my tea." Joan smiled. "You make that sound like a profession." "It is," Ruth said, raising her cup in mock solemnity. By the end of the first evening, Joan had been invited to the small book club that met by the fire each night. They read short stories mostly, Annie Proulx, Raymond Carver, Mary Oliver poems on the nights when the group grew quiet. Joan listened more than she spoke, her fingers tracing the rim of her mug, the flames reflected in her glasses. She liked being no one here, no title, no mother, no caretaker. Just a woman who showed up and paid attention. In her cottage each night, she wrote in her journal. At first, just small notes. The sound of wind through the trees, the taste of lemon tea, the word freedom written 3 times in different ink. But on the 4th night, the words shifted. She wrote about Henry, his steady laugh, his easy trust in her, and about Brett, the son who had once built forts in the living room and now spoke to her like an inconvenience. She ended that entry with one line, circled in ink. "They think loneliness is a punishment. It isn't. It's a resource." Her phone, tucked in the bedside drawer, buzzed twice before she finally looked. Messages from Brett, then Melanie. "Brett, just making sure you're okay out there. Mel's worried. This whole trip thing feels weird. Melanie, we're just concerned. It's sad, really, to see you pulling away from family. Holidays aren't the same without you." Joan stared at the screen until it dimmed. She imagined them in their house. Open concept, gleaming surfaces, crafting these messages with half genuine concern and half control. She didn't reply. The next morning, after breakfast, she went to the front desk and asked the attendant how to block incoming calls on the cabin's Wi-Fi phone service. The young woman smiled knowingly. "No problem, Ms. Halstead. Happens more often than you'd think." By afternoon, the peace was absolute. She read by the lake until the light turned copper, listening to the water's slow rhythm. The sky mirrored her mood. Wide, steady, a little wild around the edges. That evening, she joined Thomas and Ruth for dinner. Ruth told a story about a disastrous performance in Milan, all sequins and fire alarms, and Joan laughed until tears rolled down her cheeks. Thomas raised his glass of cider toward her. "You're glowing, Joan. Vermont suits you." "Maybe it's just oxygen," she said, smiling. Later that night, a single text slipped through before she silenced her phone completely. It was from Eileen. "Eileen, I hope you're eating good butter, woman. None of that retreat margarine nonsense." Joan laughed aloud, the sound startling even herself. She typed back quickly, "Real butter, every morning, and quiet so thick you could slice it. Then she powered the phone off and set it face down. Outside, the moon broke cleanly through the clouds, turning the lake into a sheet of white glass. Joan stepped onto the porch, pulling her shawl tight around her shoulders. The air shimmered with cold, the night alive with stillness. She felt utterly alone and utterly safe. Inside, the fire burned low. Her journal lay open to a fresh page, the pen poised over it like a held breath. She hesitated, listening, to the lake, the wind, the whisper of her own heartbeat, before writing one line that startled her with its clarity. "When I go home, things will not be the same." She stared at the sentence for a long time, the ink still wet, knowing it was both a promise and a threat. The house didn't feel like a trap anymore. Joan stepped through the front door with her bag still slung over her shoulder and a pine scent clinging faintly to her coat. The December light through the foyer windows caught on dust she hadn't noticed before. Little golden specks floating in the air like ash. She didn't rush to unpack. She didn't turn on music or call anyone. She just stood in the stillness, letting the house reacquaint itself with her presence. In the kitchen, the fruit bowl had shriveled into a study in decay. Apples puckered, bananas dark as soil. She threw them all away, rinsed the bowl, and filled it with nothing. That afternoon, she retrieved the envelope from the back of the desk drawer, the one with her old estate papers, and spread them across the dining table. Brett's name appeared again and again, Melanie's just beneath, neatly printed in legalese. There was a trust, a health proxy, joint signatory permissions. It was efficient. It was designed when she still believed keeping peace required surrender. By morning, she'd rewritten it all. Her attorney, Gavin Marks, was a precise man with kind eyes and a desk cluttered with fountain pens. He flipped through the new draft as Joan sat across from him, fingers laced loosely in her lap. She wore a charcoal turtleneck and no makeup. She felt like stone. "No ambiguity here," Gavin said, sliding the top page aside. "You've removed both Brett and Melanie as beneficiaries. No fallback clauses, no future reconsideration triggers. Are you sure?" "Yes," she said simply. He gave a slow nod, not pressing. "And Amber?" Joan leaned forward. "She gets a fund, not a gift, not a ticket." He turned the page. "I see it here, released upon proof of either a college degree or documented service in a non-profit or government field. Administered by a third party. She's still young. I don't want her incentivized to orbit their dysfunction. If she finds her way out, the support will be waiting. But not before." Gavin looked impressed. "This is airtight." "And the house?" she asked. He adjusted his glasses. "You added a home preservation clause. No sale or transfer for 20 years, except to Amber if she qualifies. That's a very specific kind of stake. I'm tired of them thinking everything I touch turns into their inheritance," Joan said, her voice sharper now. "This house is not a hand-me-down. It's my life, my mistakes, my restoration. It gets to breathe after me." Gavin studied her for a moment. "There's something different about you, Joan." She smiled slightly. "I started listening to myself." He gestured for her to sign the final page. She did, the pen gliding cleanly. When she looked at her signature, it felt like something permanent had shifted. Less like cutting ties and more like cutting free. Outside his office, the wind had picked up. Joan pulled her coat tight, stepped out into the chilled air and exhaled deeply. A layer had peeled off her. She didn't miss it. That night, Eileen came over with a bakery box and her usual blunt cheer. "Coconut cake. I know it's your favorite, even though you always pretend it isn't." Joan raised an eyebrow. "Because it tastes like sunscreen. And yet you eat every bite. You're a mystery." They sat at the kitchen island, a new quiet between them, one that didn't need filling. Eileen forked into her slice and said, "So, word is you burned it all down today." "Not burned," Joan replied. "Rebuilt, without them standing on my neck." Eileen grinned. "And yet still so polite. You're practically a ghost story for toxic children." Joan laughed, and it didn't stick in her throat this time. "Let's drink to being cautionary tales." Eileen raised her fork like a toast. "To the women who stop apologizing." Later, after the cake was gone and the dishwasher hummed, Joan sat alone in the living room. The fireplace crackled low. She had pulled out an old quilt and was wrapping herself in it when the mail slot clinked. It was late, nearly 10. No footsteps on the porch, no car in the drive. She hesitated before getting up. A manila envelope had been pushed through the door, no return address, no postage. She bent to pick it up. On the front, in blue ink, 2 words in handwriting she hadn't seen in over 30 years. From Henry. Her fingers froze on the edge. The wind outside moaned low and constant. She didn't open it, not yet. The envelope from Henry sat untouched on the mantel for 3 days. Joan passed it each morning like a room she wasn't ready to enter. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was the knowing, the way certain truths rearrange things once opened. On the 4th day, she woke before dawn, drawn not to the envelope, but to her phone. She hadn't powered it on since Vermont. It blinked to life with a slow, stuttering breath. 47 unread messages, 2 voicemails, 5 group threads where her name pulsed like a warning flare. She ignored them all. Instead, she opened Instagram. It was Melanie's account that loaded first, thanks to the app's lingering memory of her last accidental scroll. Joan nearly closed it. Then she didn't. The top post was a picture of a candlelit table, cranberry glass, gold chargers, expensive napkin folds, and the caption, "Still finding grace even when family forgets what the holidays mean. Some people choose silence, we choose love. No names, no direct call-out." But the performance was unmistakable. Joan didn't feel anger, not even the old pulse of shame. She just felt seen. Another post followed. Melanie in a soft-focus selfie with Brett and Amber behind her, all in red flannel. Caption, "Grateful for the ones who show up." Joan took a screenshot, then another and another. By the 6th post, something in her steadied. This was the record. This was their narrative, broadcast with filters and passive slights. And here she was, quiet, deliberate, and no longer offering her silence as permission. She created a new album on her phone and titled it Documentation. But that wasn't enough. She needed something real, something with weight. That afternoon, she pulled a large sketchbook from the linen closet, unused, still wrapped in cellophane from a gift she'd once forgotten to return. She peeled it open, its blank pages smelling faintly of glue and dust, and titled the first one with careful pen strokes, "This house remembers me." She started with the front door, photographing it, then writing beneath, "I crossed this threshold broken and walked back through it whole." The next day, the kitchen. She stood at the sink and snapped a Polaroid, steam rising from a chipped mug, the knife block catching a square of sunlight. Underneath, "Here, I fed people who believed I owed them more than food. But I also fed myself." Joan moved room by room, day by day. The upstairs hall with the warped floorboard where Brett used to run toy trucks. The den where Melanie once held baby Amber against her chest, humming off-key. The laundry room that always smelled of lavender, where Joan once cried into a basket of mismatched socks and swore no one would ever see her that small again. She wrote what the house would never say aloud. By week's end, the scrapbook had 5 filled pages and a rhythm. It wasn't grief, it wasn't vengeance. It was something quieter, sturdier, like weathered wood that refused to rot. Each morning, she took a single Polaroid of something ordinary, the way the light fractured through her living room blinds, her coffee mug resting on a half-read novel, the corner of her porch railing dusted in frost. The photos were imperfect, often slightly off-center. That made them feel truer. One evening, while making dinner, she opened a drawer to reach for a rubber band and paused. The space was bare except for a faded coupon, an old pen, and the gentle hush of undisturbed corners. She reached for her notepad and wrote a single line on the top page. "I mattered here." Then she folded the note in half and placed it beneath the rubber band. That night, she moved Henry's envelope from the mantel to her desk. She stared at it for a long time, tracing the loop of the H, the final swoop of the Y. Her fingers twitched, but she didn't tear it open. Instead, she picked up her phone again and opened Facebook, an account she hadn't used since the early 2010s, but never deleted. Her login still worked. The blue banner blinked to life like a relic from another version of herself. There, in the People You May Know section, sat a familiar name, Henry C. Davis. No photo, just the placeholder silhouette and a friend count of 1. And beneath it, Updated cover photo 3 days ago, Joan clicked. The photo was grainy, a field. Not just any field. She knew that fence line, that tree line. She had stood there once, long ago. He had gone back, and he wanted her to know. The clinic smelled like lemon floor polish and old magazines. Joan sat in the waiting room in a navy wool coat, her posture straight, her purse neatly zipped beside her. Across from her, a younger woman with tired eyes and a toddler on her lap gave her a cautious smile. Joan returned it, then folded her hands in her lap and waited. She had made this appointment herself. No referrals, no family urging her in whispers to just get it checked out, no Brett forwarding articles about elder care planning, no Melanie emailing memory screeners with subject lines like just in case. When the nurse called her name, Joan stood without help. She walked the hallway with sure steps. The exam room was bright and unassuming, with soft yellow walls and a painting of a beach hung just slightly crooked. Dr. Harriman was in his late 40s, thoughtful but not patronizing. He'd reviewed her intake ahead of time, and he didn't ask her how often she lost her keys or whether she remembered what day it was. Instead, he asked what had brought her in. "I'd like a comprehensive cognitive assessment," she said evenly, "for my records." His pen paused mid-note. "Any specific concerns?" "No," she said, "but other people seem to have them." He nodded once, not probing further. The test took just under an hour. Word recall, pattern logic, timed puzzles, drawing intersecting shapes. When it was over, he glanced through the results and leaned back in his chair. "Well," he said with a dry smile, "you scored well above average for your age group. Frankly, you scored well above average, full stop." Joan arched an eyebrow. "You sound surprised?" "Just impressed. You've got mild arthritis in your dominant hand. That's why your spatial test slowed a bit. But your cognitive function is clear, sharp, and organized. Exceptionally independent." She allowed herself a quiet smile. "Would you be willing to summarize those findings in a letter?" "I'd be glad to." Outside, the wind had picked up, cold threading through the collar of her coat. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment before heading to Gavin's office with the envelope in hand. He met her in the hallway with his usual warmth and a fresh cup of tea. "Well," he said, reading the letter, "this should shut a few mouths." "I want it on file," Joan said. "So if Melanie or Brett ever try to contest anything, we have time-stamped documentation." "I'll include it with the estate packet," he said, "and the trust adjustments." She sipped her tea and exhaled. "I want my stability to be inconvenient for them." Gavin grinned. "You're more stable than the GDP, Joan." That afternoon, she posted a note on her neighborhood forum offering gently used furniture to anyone who could use it. By evening, most of it was gone. The sideboard Brett always rolled his eyes at, the guest room dresser with Melanie's scratch marks on the drawer pulls, even the ugly ottoman Henry once insisted on buying because it was durable. A woman from the women's shelter down the highway arrived in a borrowed van. Joan helped her load the pieces, neither of them speaking much. Before she left, the woman glanced at the house, then at Joan. "These things matter more than people admit," she said. Joan nodded. "Yes, they do." With the room emptied, she opened the windows and let the cold pour in. Then she started measuring. The walls would hold books. The corner by the window would cradle a chair in navy velvet. She'd add a record player, a reading lamp, maybe a rug in deep green that reminded her of Vermont moss, a sanctuary, but no longer for guests. That night, Eileen dropped off a box of her own, 2 armloads of mystery novels, a barely used diffuser, and a tiny wooden plaque that read, "Do not disturb, genius at work." "Thought it might look good next to a cup of tea and your middle finger," she said, and left without waiting for thanks. Joan laughed, carried the box upstairs, and arranged the books by mood, not alphabet. Outside, frost climbed the window panes like ivy. The house felt newly uncluttered, purposeful. She walked downstairs, her steps echoing differently now. The envelope from Henry still sat on her desk, unopened. That night, she finally broke the seal. Inside wasn't a letter. It was a photograph. 2 children, barefoot in a summer field, and a single sentence on the back, written in his uneven scrawl, "I still remember what we buried." The sourdough cooled on the windowsill, while the light slanted in gold across the kitchen tile. Joan had started baking again, not as a gesture, not for guests, but because it filled the house with warmth that wasn't performative. The bread cracked softly as it cooled, crust splitting like dry earth. She wrapped it in a clean linen towel and set out 2 mugs beside the kettle. When the knock came, it was quiet, hesitant. Amber stood on the porch in a burgundy coat 2 sizes too large, sleeves swallowing her hands. Her hair was unbrushed, no makeup, no performance. Joan opened the door and stepped aside without a word. Amber blinked into the entryway, her hands twisting at the hem of her coat. "Hi, come in before the tea gets cold," Joan said. They sat at the small table by the window, the one Joan had cleared of papers and Polaroids that morning, as if she'd known Amber would come. Joan poured 2 cups of Earl Grey. Amber's fingers shook when she lifted hers, but she didn't spill a drop. "I saw the post," she said, "about the furniture, the reading lounge, and I don't know why, but it made me want to see you." Joan didn't answer right away. She sliced the bread with the practiced rhythm of someone who'd done it alone for years. "I didn't speak up," Amber said suddenly, the words catching in her throat. "When they started saying things about you, Mel, mostly, but Brett too, I didn't say anything. I just stayed quiet." Joan placed a slice of bread on Amber's plate and returned to her seat. "Silence," she said gently, "is its own inheritance." Amber's eyes filled. "I should have told them they were wrong. About the retreat. About you pulling away. About the money. All of it." "You were raised in their gravity," Joan said. "I don't blame you for the orbit. I just wanted you to recognize the pull." "I do now." They ate slowly, no music, no background noise, just the wind pushing against the old windows and the occasional hum of the kettle reheating. After the last crumbs were cleared and the second cup poured, Joan reached into the drawer beside her and pulled out a small brown paper bag. She handed it to Amber. Amber opened it and lifted out 3 tulip bulbs, still dusted with dry earth. "October's late for planting," Joan said, "but this yard surprises me sometimes." They moved outside in wool coats and gloves, Joan holding the trowel, Amber the bulbs. The garden beds ran low along the fence, quiet now, asleep in autumn's lull. Together they worked the soil, scooping space for new life without speaking too much. Joan showed her how deep to set the bulbs. Amber pressed them into the ground like wishes she was afraid to make. After the last bulb was buried, Joan stood slowly, wiping her hands on her coat. The wind blew through the trees like a breath held too long. She reached into her pocket and held out a key. Not shiny, not ceremonial. Just the copy she kept in the kitchen drawer on a faded red lanyard. Amber stared at it. "Are you?" Joan didn't let her finish. "It's not a symbol. It's practical. For watering plants. For keeping an eye on things if I'm away." Amber took the key but didn't put it in her pocket. She held it with both hands like it might vanish. "I want to earn your trust again," she said. "Not just be handed it because I'm blood." Joan looked at her for a long moment. "Then don't show up with apologies. Show up with a shovel." Amber smiled, tearful and raw. "I can do that." They stood in silence, the garden quiet between them. Inside, the house glowed with lamplight and the scent of bread still lingering in the air. Joan stepped back inside first, leaving the door open behind her. Amber didn't follow immediately. She turned to look at the yard again, then at the house, this time not like an outsider peeking in, but like someone trying to remember where the cracks had first begun. And inside the front hall, beneath the row of coats, Joan's phone buzzed twice and fell silent. From Brett. "We heard you're seeing Amber. This is getting out of hand," from Melanie. "You can't just rewrite everything, Mom." Joan didn't open either message. Instead, she reached for her Polaroid, snapped a photo of the guest key lying in Amber's hand, and added it to the scrapbook. Page 6. Some inherit wounds, others inherit the tools to close them. The email came just before sunrise. Joan had been awake, not because of restlessness, but because of habit, old mothering reflexes that died harder than she liked to admit. She sipped hot water with lemon and stared out the kitchen window, waiting for the frost to lift off the bird bath. When the chime echoed from her phone, she knew. The subject line was curt. "You leave us no choice." She opened it calmly. Brett's tone was colder than usual. No greetings, no soft edges. Just bullet point grievances couched in legal insinuation. Undue influence, diminished capacity, reckless exclusion. He referenced questionable actions regarding the trust, manipulative third parties, and his belief that Mom may no longer be acting in her own best interest. It read like a man trying to break a door down with a stapler. The final line struck her as almost laughably theatrical. If this isn't resolved amicably, we'll take this to court. She forwarded it to Gavin with one line. Please handle. Gavin called her an hour later. His voice was calm, crisp, already at work. I've drafted a formal response and included the estate revisions timeline, your cognitive assessment, notarized statements from both Eileen and Dr. Harriman confirming your independence, and the affidavit I had you sign last month. You anticipated this, she said. I didn't trust him not to try, Gavin replied. People like Brett confuse access with entitlement. When that changes, they panic. Joan exhaled. How bad will it get? Not bad at all, Gavin said, his tone like fresh paper being smoothed. Judge Fields already reviewed the documents when we filed your estate packet. Given your assessment and the completeness of the file, he's preemptively sealed the case to discourage frivolous action. They'd need clear and immediate evidence of fraud or abuse to even get a hearing. Which they don't have, she paused. Sealed? Gavin nodded through the phone. Your home, your documents, your autonomy, legally bulletproof. They can posture, but the control they think they lost was never rightfully theirs. Joan didn't cry, but she sat down and let the warmth of safety sink all the way into her bones. Later that afternoon, Eileen arrived in her usual whirlwind of wind-chapped cheeks and boot heels scuffed from the garden. I come bearing gifts, she said, handing Joan a long, narrow package wrapped in brown paper and twine. And you're not allowed to say it's too much. I know you. Joan unwrapped it slowly. Inside was a wooden plaque, hand-painted in bold white brushstrokes. My living room, my rules. Joan laughed, full-throated and unguarded. This is going to piss off exactly the right people. I figured it might go nicely over the fireplace, Eileen said, grinning. Consider it a ceremonial end to everyone's bullshit. They hung it together, stepping back to admire it. The plaque sat above the mantel like a quiet crown, less an announcement, more a declaration. Joan turned on the lamp beside the reading chair and stood a moment, eyes scanning the room. The walls bore Polaroids and shelves of books. The fireplace glowed low with the ease of old embers. Her scrapbook sat open on the coffee table, pages fanned gently by the breeze from the heater vent. This house, she said, almost to herself, is now a fortress, for peace. Eileen raised her mug. Not a bad legacy. Joan smiled, but didn't toast. She was already thinking ahead, to the bulbs under the earth outside, to Amber's quiet resolve, to the portrait of herself she had slowly been repainting with every decision not made in fear. That evening, Joan reread Brett's email once more, not to relive it, but to mark it as the last time his words would ever have consequence. Then she deleted it. She opened her laptop and created a new folder, titling it, Closure Files, Do Not Reopen. She slid Gavin's documents inside, saved them, backed them up, then closed the laptop. As she stood to add another log to the fire, her phone lit up again. A number she didn't recognize. No text this time, just a voicemail icon. She stared at it for a long moment, then hit play. Henry's voice crackled through the speaker, aged, uneven, but unmistakable. Joan, if you got the photo, then you know what I meant. I think it's time we talk. I'm nearby, but only if you want. He paused. Then, softer. The tree's still standing, and so are we. The message ended. Joan stood very still. The fire popped. The plaque hung steady on the wall, and somewhere just beyond the window, the wind shifted. Joan adjusted the collar of her coat as she stepped through the courthouse doors. The marble echoed underfoot, the kind of sound that made you feel either very small or very certain. She chose the latter. Amber walked beside her, silent but steady. Gavin trailed just behind, briefcase in hand, his expression unreadable except for the glint of preemptive victory in his eyes. They took their seats near the front, the courtroom mostly empty except for a few clerks and a man with earbuds waiting for a traffic citation. Brett sat on the opposite bench, alone. His tie was crooked. His jaw clenched the way it always had when he didn't get to control the room. He didn't look at Joan. That was fine. Judge Fields entered quietly. Gray hair. Unbothered posture. No nonsense gavel. Joan had met him once, briefly, in Gavin's office, and had liked him immediately. He struck her as the kind of man who never confused loudness with legitimacy. The clerk called the docket number. Brett stood. So did Joan. Mr. Halstead, Judge Fields began, glancing at the file on his bench. You're petitioning for a restraining order against your mother? Brett cleared his throat. Yes, Your Honor. I believe she's been subject to manipulation and undue influence, and that her recent decisions, financial and emotional, are evidence of declining mental health and coercion by parties, including her friend Eileen Marks and a young woman named Amber, who may be receiving unearned favoritism in the new estate plan. Joan remained still. I also believe, Brett continued, that her refusal to engage with family and her increased isolation is consistent with emotional harm toward herself and others. Judge Fields didn't react. He simply flipped through the folder Gavin had filed. Well, he said, tapping a finger against the page, your mother appears to have completed a cognitive assessment with scores in the 92nd percentile. Her physician confirms full independence, and her legal counsel, who's been her attorney of record for over a decade, filed timely, notarized updates to all estate documents, signed, witnessed, uncontested until this moment. Brett's mouth opened, closed. Fields looked up. What you're describing is a woman who made a choice. That doesn't make her unstable, it makes her autonomous. He paused, reading again. And this petition includes no new evidence, no police reports, no threats. Just your discomfort with her boundaries and revised decisions. Brett flushed. Fields leaned forward. You don't get to weaponize the court system because you don't like your mother's independence, Mr. Halstead. Silence folded over the room. The restraining order is denied, Fields said, voice clipped. And you're fined $1,500 for filing a baseless petition and wasting the court's time. This matter is closed. The gavel fell. Joan didn't move for a full beat. Then she exhaled through her nose, slow, steady, and reached for her bag. Brett turned to say something, but Amber stepped between them. Her stare wasn't angry. It was clean, final. Don't, she said. Not today. Outside, the wind was softer. The sky streaked with low sunlight, the kind that made winter seem like a manageable promise rather than a threat. Joan walked to the parking garage and measured steps, her heels clicking with quiet finality. At the car, Amber opened the passenger door and then stood before closing it. You taught me everything today, she said. Joan tilted her head. I didn't speak much. That's what made it loud. Joan smiled, tired and fierce. It's not always about yelling. Sometimes it's just about standing and letting someone else fall over their own noise. Amber looked like she might cry, but didn't. Instead, she took a folded piece of paper from her pocket and handed it over. What's this? A letter, Amber said. For them, not to give now, for later, if they ever wonder how this looked from the outside. Joan slipped it into the glove box. We may never need it. We might, Amber said. But either way, they won't write the ending. Joan started the car. The engine hummed to life. Amber climbed in. They pulled away from the courthouse, the building shrinking in the rearview mirror. Ahead, the road forked in two directions, one toward home, the other toward the tree line. Joan tapped her turn signal. Amber glanced over. Are we? Joan smiled faintly. We're going to the field. The reporter arrived with a notebook, not a recorder, and a sweater with a coffee stain near the cuff. Joan liked her immediately. I'm not interested in scandal, the woman said, setting her bag down on the table where Joan had once braided Amber's hair. I'm interested in how women hold the line, especially when it's late, especially when no one expects them to. Joan poured 2 cups of tea and nodded. Then we'll get along just fine. It had started innocently enough. An op-ed about elder autonomy that Eileen had flagged in the local paper's online section. Joan had read it, liked it, left a short comment under her initials. A week later, the editor reached out, asking if she'd consider being interviewed for a profile on independent aging. She said yes, not for attention, not to make a point. just to make sure someone else out there, some woman sitting at a quiet table with the echoes of too many opinions around her, might recognize herself in the mirror. The interview took place over 2 afternoons. No lights. No camera. Just questions about legacy, about autonomy, about what it meant to be misunderstood on purpose. "I don't feel brave," Joan said once, folding her hands around her mug. "I feel like I ran out of places to store my fear." The article published the following Sunday in the human interest section beneath a column on retired beekeepers. Its title made her blink twice. "Not a Nuisance. One Woman's Stand for Dignity." Joan read it once in print, seated at her kitchen island with the paper laid flat. The words were accurate. Fair. There were no photos, just a single pull quote beside a headline. "Autonomy is not defiance. It's survival." She expected it to pass quietly. It didn't. Within hours, the comment section flooded with messages. Women named Carol and Lorraine and Dee wrote about losing their homes, their voices, their children's respect. Men chimed in too, sons apologizing to mothers they hadn't called. Nurses, caregivers, legal aides, each post a ripple, each name a small flag of solidarity. Joan didn't respond to any of them. She just read and read again. Amber printed out the full piece on archival paper and framed a copy. Joan thanked her, but later took the page and taped it, unframed, inside the kitchen cabinet behind the mugs. A place she'd see it each morning, alone, without ceremony. Melanie, predictably, unsubscribed from every local news alert. Brett didn't reply to the email a cousin had forwarded him with the subject line, "Your mom's in the paper. Good for her." The silence from both of them was a kind of applause. Joan didn't need to win anymore, but she didn't mind if they noticed how far they'd lost. Eileen showed up with a bottle of Prosecco and a smile that didn't ask permission. "To quiet women," she said, raising her glass. "Who decided they're allowed to be loud whenever they damn well feel like it?" Joan sipped. "You do realize I didn't even say much." "You didn't have to," Eileen said. "You stayed standing." That night, as the house settled and the radiators ticked in the way they always did when winter pressed in, Joan climbed the stairs and paused in the hallway. Outside, the wind nudged the shutters. She thought about the tree, about Henry. She walked into the reading lounge, once a guest room, once a holding pen for obligation, and pulled the curtain open to let the moonlight in. Her scrapbook lay open on the ottoman, the Polaroid of Amber's hands holding the key still visible. She turned the page. The next one was blank. A new entry was needed. She picked up her pen and wrote in slow, deliberate lines. "They tried to revise me, but I wrote myself in ink." She placed a fresh Polaroid beneath the quote, just her hand, holding the newspaper headline beside a cup of tea. The house exhaled. The doorbell rang. Once, then again. Not urgent, not hesitant. She stood, heart steady. Some stories arrived quietly. Others knocked. The pain began as a whisper behind her sternum, more pressure than panic, like someone pressing a thumb into her chest and waiting to see if she'd flinch. Joan was slicing apples for a galette, the late morning sun turning the kitchen tiles into a checkerboard of gold and shadow. She paused, one hand flat against the counter, the paring knife still in the other. It passed, then returned harder, sharper. Like an old wound testing whether she remembered it. She set the knife down. By the time she reached the phone, her left arm had gone heavy. The 911 operator was calm, precise. Joan answered every question, her voice even but slower now, as if her lungs were second-guessing their contract with her ribs. She unlocked the front door and slid down onto the hallway bench, clutching her shawl like it could hold her together. The EMTs arrived just in time to catch her before the black edge of her vision folded in completely. She woke to the soft beep of a heart monitor and the sterile quiet of room 314. The sheets were thin, her mouth dry, but she was still here, and Amber was asleep in a chair beside her, arms crossed, head tilted awkwardly toward the window. Someone had brought her a hoodie. Joan recognized it as her own. Years old, still bearing the faint scent of cedar and dish soap. A nurse stepped in, young and sharp-eyed, holding a chart and a smile. "Ms. Halstead, welcome back." Joan cleared her throat. "What happened?" "Mild myocardial infarction," the nurse said. Caught early, good vitals. You'll be cursing us for keeping you another night. Joan's lips curled dryly. Already am, the nurse chuckled, scribbling a note. Your emergency contact responded immediately. Amber, right? Joan nodded, a flicker of something settling in her chest, something other than the echo of pain. She showed up. She never left, the nurse said, stepping closer. Also, sorry to do this, but I have to ask, are you the Joan Halstead from the Dignity article? Joan blinked. Depends who's asking, the nurse grinned. I read it twice. My mom laminated a copy and stuck it to her fridge. Said if I ever pull power of attorney on her without permission, she'll haunt me. Joan chuckled weakly, head turning toward the window. Tell her I like her style. She says you're a badass, Joan smiled. I'm just someone who likes her living room the way it is. By the time Eileen and Gavin arrived, Joan had sat up in bed and demanded real coffee. The nurse brought her chamomile instead, and she took it like a truce. Eileen barged in first, holding a bouquet that looked like it had been dragged through a hedge. I told them I was family. You think they believed me? They let you in, Joan murmured. So they must have been scared. Gavin followed with a legal pad under one arm and a bag of pastries in the other. Jesus, Joan. You scared the hell out of us. I scared myself, she admitted. I thought I was just dehydrated. Turns out I was on the edge of checking out through the side door. Well, Eileen said, fluffing the pillow behind her. You're too stubborn to go just yet. Joan looked at them, her lawyer, her friend, her almost daughter sleeping in a vinyl chair nearby, and felt a strange, steady clarity. I have too much left to arrange, she said quietly, and too many photos left to take. They stayed with her until visiting hours ended. Amber stirred, sat up, and took her hand. No grand declarations, just warmth, just presence. Before they left, Eileen pinned something to the corkboard on the wall, a Polaroid she'd snapped while Joan was still asleep. It showed the edge of Joan's hospital bed, the article headline in her lap, and Amber's hand resting over hers. Eileen winked, just keeping the scrapbook honest. That night, the room dim and humming, Joan stared at the ceiling tiles and listened to the sound of her own pulse. It was slower now, but steady. The door opened once more. A shadow crossed the foot of the bed. A familiar voice said softly, You said I could come, if I remembered. Henry. By the time Joan came home from the hospital, winter had fully arrived. The house smelled faintly of rosemary and clean linen. Amber had been through, leaving signs of care that didn't announce themselves. New tea towels folded in the drawer, fresh tulips in a mason jar. The heat turned up just enough to keep the pipes from complaining. Joan paused in the doorway, one hand on the frame. The air was still, but not empty. It felt like the house itself had been waiting for her return. On the mantel, the wooden plaque, My living room, my rules, caught a bar of pale sunlight and seemed to glow faintly, like an altarpiece for a creed she'd already lived. Gavin arrived 3 days later, coat collar up, briefcase tucked beneath one arm. He looked the way she remembered Henry looking when he'd been too proud to say he cared. Efficient, serious, carrying too much weight in the shoulders. Ready? He asked gently, spreading papers across the dining table she'd scrubbed spotless that morning. Joan nodded. Ready. The documents lay in careful stacks. The new estate plan, the living will, the preservation trust, each marked with yellow tabs where her signature belonged. Her handwriting, once a teacher's pride, had steadied again since the hospital, firm, legible, deliberate. This one first, Gavin said, tapping the top page. The Preservation Trust. It transfers ownership of the property to a stewardship entity. You, while living, and after, Amber as the primary custodian. It prevents sale or structural redesign for 25 years. 25, Joan said, raising a brow. I took your original 20-year clause and gave it an extra 5 for spite. Joan smiled. That's very you. He handed her a pen. And very you to make it legal. She signed with care, the ink sinking clean into the paper. Each stroke felt final but not fatal, an act of authorship, not surrender. Next came the fund designation. The literacy grant, Gavin said, sliding it forward. You asked me to name it after Henry. Yes, Joan said softly. He may have lost himself in the end, but he never stopped believing words could build a life, She paused. Let them build a few more. Consider it done. They continued in silence, the only sound the faint scratch of her pen and the hum of the furnace. When the final page was complete, Gavin gathered the stack and tapped it neatly on the table edge. His tone softened. You understand, Joan. They'll never touch a brick of this place now. Not one. That's the point, she said. They wanted a monument to control. I built a refuge instead. Eileen arrived as he was packing up, waving a grocery bag like a victory flag. I heard a rumor there's a signing ceremony happening, and I brought the sacrament, dark chocolate and cheap champagne. Gavin laughed. She's more efficient than a notary. Eileen plunked the chocolate onto the table. You're officially untouchable, Joan. How does it feel? Joan broke a square of chocolate, let it melt on her tongue before she answered. Like I just finished my autobiography. You mean this? Eileen tapped the scrapbook on the shelf, its cover embossed faintly with "This house remembers me." No, Joan said, smiling. I mean this. She gestured around, the walls, the windows, the air thick with quiet. All of it. They toasted with paper cups. Gavin promised to file the documents by morning. Eileen promised to replace the terrible hospital flowers with something worthy. Joan promised herself to rest, but when they left and the house fell still again, she didn't go upstairs. She went to her desk. The manila envelope from Henry, once opened, never answered, lay in the drawer. She took it out, the paper still carrying the faint scent of cedar and thyme. The photograph of the field rested inside, its edges beginning to curl. She flipped it over and stared again at the words scrawled on the back. I still remember what we buried. Her pen hovered above it. For a moment she thought about tearing it up, letting the past dissolve the way it should. Instead, she added 5 words beneath his. It's time we dug it up. Outside, snow had begun to fall, fine, relentless, the kind that softened everything it touched. And for the first time in years, Joan packed a small overnight bag and left the porch light on. It was Amber who found her. She had come by early, before the frost lifted from the grass, carrying 2 thermoses of coffee and a stack of papers Joan had asked her to look over. Something about a new literary donation for the library board. The porch light was still on, which at first didn't seem unusual. Joan had always preferred to rise before the sun. The front door was unlocked. Inside, the house was warm and still. A kettle sat untouched on the stove. The reading lounge smelled faintly of lavender and paper. Joan was in the armchair by the window, a blanket folded neatly across her lap, hands resting peacefully atop a closed journal. There was no drama in it, no unfinished business or unanswered calls. She had simply gone quiet. The service was small, by her design. Amber stood at the lectern in a black wool coat with her hair tucked into a low bun, her voice steady. She read aloud from Joan's instructions, which had been left in an envelope labeled, "If I slip away before spring." The pastor took over, a soft-spoken man from the community center Joan had quietly supported for years. He read the words she had written. To my house, thank you for holding me. For every echo I softened with music. For every door I shut that stayed shut. For letting me become someone inside you who didn't flinch. I leave you in peace. Not as an escape, but as a gift. There were no floral sprays, no slideshow, no long speeches. No one cried loudly. But the silence in the chapel was complete, reverent. Even the children in the back, too young to understand grief but old enough to sense importance, stayed quiet. Melanie didn't come. Brett sat in the very last row, alone, not looking at anyone. His suit was wrinkled, his jaw locked tight. He didn't speak to Amber. He didn't approach the casket. He left before the final hymn. Amber didn't watch him go. Back at the house, a kettle boiled on the stove, and Eileen wandered the garden with a small paper sack cradled in her arms. She wore Joan's old gardening coat, the sleeves still faintly stained with soil. Without ceremony, she knelt by the porch steps. The ground was cold but yielding. She dug carefully, placing each tulip bulb into the dirt, with the quiet attention of someone who understood that rebirth had less to do with flowers and more to do with intention. This is for the mornings you didn't quit, she said softly. She stood, wiped her hands on her jeans, and looked up at the window where the curtain still swayed slightly, as if Joan had just stepped out of frame. Amber stood inside, watching. They didn't wave. They didn't need to. Later that evening, Amber made tea and sat in Joan's chair with the journal she'd been found holding. The cover was unmarked, the first page dated just 2 weeks before. Inside, the handwriting was slightly shakier than before, but no less deliberate. The entries weren't lengthy, just observations, glimpses. The snow feels less like a warning this year. I'm not afraid to leave, but I'm not in a rush either. The house hums at night. I think it's singing. The final page was dated the night before she passed. It read, "If I don't wake up, don't panic. This isn't failure. This is a woman finally taking the exit on her terms. I built a home. I told the truth. I changed the ending. What more could I ask from a life?" Amber pressed her hand to the page, then turned it. And on the inside back cover, written in soft pencil, were 4 words. "This house kept me." She closed the journal and let the room return to stillness. The fire in the hearth flickered low. The mantel plaque watched over her like a sentinel. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and endless, the kind of snow that asked the world to hush. Inside, the light stayed on. The envelope was tucked inside the back cover of the scrapbook. Amber found it 2 weeks after the service, as she stood in the reading lounge with sunlight warming the floorboards and silence stretching itself like a cat in the corners. The envelope was unsealed. Her name, Amber Lee Halstead, was written in Joan's handwriting, unshaken and sure. She opened it slowly. Inside was a single-page letter, folded crisply in thirds. The paper was heavier than usual, like something meant to last. "This is not a house. It's where I earned my space. I was told too many times to keep quiet in rooms I paid for, cleaned, held together with my own hands. I learned how to turn that quiet into a weapon, into structure, into something nobody could evict me from. Now it's yours to keep safe, not as a shrine, but as a promise, to keep telling the truth, to keep the door open only when it should be, to let the rooms breathe, but not be rewritten. And if the wind ever tries to blow the plaque down, nail it back up. They called me a nuisance in my own living room, so I made sure they'd never step foot in it again." Joan Amber folded the letter back, slower than she'd opened it, and pressed it to her chest. The first thing she did was check the fireplace. The plaque was still there. My living room, my rules, centered, defiant, and just a little crooked. She left it exactly as it was. Next came the scrapbook. Amber sat cross-legged on the floor and opened it gently, turning through each Polaroid with care, the key in her hand, the light falling across Joan's mug, the small photo of her hospital bed pinned by Eileen. Each caption felt like a sentence written in stone, none of them asking for forgiveness, only recognition. She added one more photo. A selfie, nothing dramatic. Just her, barefoot, holding a book by the window with the tulips outside just beginning to breach the soil. On a yellow sticky note below it, she wrote, "Still here, still reading." By spring, Amber had painted nothing, changed nothing. The guest room remained a reading lounge. Joan's chair still faced east. The pantry still held too much Earl Grey. The house breathed with her, not despite her. One Sunday a month, Amber opened the front door to the community and called it Quiet House. People came with books, journals, thermoses of soup. They didn't ask questions, no speeches, no name tags. Just the rules Joan once lived by. Be still, pay attention, let the room remember you. The regulars left notes in a wooden bowl near the door. Some thanked her, some didn't sign their names. One, written in shaky pen on an index card, read, "I was told I was too much noise. This place makes me feel like silence isn't the only way to be safe." Amber kept every one. Melanie never came, not once, not even to contest the trust. Brett sent a single letter. Amber didn't open it. She placed it in a box marked irrelevant and slid it into the basement where the pipes hummed quietly above. The house didn't miss them, neither did she. Amber lived there through college, writing papers by the fire, folding laundry in the sunlit kitchen, reading Joan's journals like a sacred text. And when her degree was framed and hung on the hallway wall, she did exactly what Joan had asked. She preserved it all. Not in amber, in use. Years later, on a spring morning that smelled like rain on concrete, Amber stood by the porch steps with a trowel in one hand and a brown paper sack in the other. Inside were tulip bulbs. Not the originals. Those had bloomed and faded and bloomed again, but new ones, replanted as ritual, as agreement. She pressed them into the dirt with careful fingers. "This is for you," she said, voice low. "And for the mornings I don't quit." Inside, the fire was lit low. The journal lay open. A new entry had been started. The plaque still hangs. The tulips still bloom. The silence still holds something sacred. And on the final page of the scrapbook, beneath a photo of the living room, empty and sun-filled, she wrote, "They called me a nuisance in my own living room, so I made sure they'd never step foot in it again."